I'm Marilla David, and we welcome you to our show, The Divorce Project. This show is for you or someone you may know who might be going through a divorce or custody battle. The Divorce Project offers legal guidance and caring solutions to help you create a healthy family dynamic during a divorce and after divorce. Next, you'll meet the host of the Divorce Project, family law attorney Barry Fisher. On each show, Barry brings together family specialists, parents, and children into a conversation about divorce and highlight the positive and mindful outcomes that can result when we all work together.
Hello and welcome to the Divorce Project. My name is Barry Fisher. I'm an attorney that specializes in family law, and today we're going to take you on a journey into the land of divorce. And hopefully we'll be able to teach you some things that will help you go through a divorce and come out with a good resolution. Today I have a wonderful friend and guest with me, Vadim Levitman. He's a certified public accountant, and we have a moderator, Jody Isaac, who's going to be moderating and asking us questions. And I'm going to let Jody take over the proceedings and begin.
Thanks, Barry. First, I thought today's show is about spousal support, alimony, child support, and a lot of the financial and accounting issues that surround that. And that's, thankfully, we have Vadim here to talk to us about all of that.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. First, Barry, let's talk about spousal support and child support.
Yes. Well, you know, every time you go through a divorce, if you have kids and you have a wife or a husband, wife and husband doesn't count in divorce, it's spouses. So it's gender neutral, that's first. So spousal support is based on 12 factors under the family code. Age, education, ability to earn money, income, separate property ownership, tax consequence, domestic violence. So there's 12 factors the court considers. There's two kinds of spousal support. There's temporary and permanent. So it's very important in doing support issues in separating whether you're seeking spousal support or child support, because child support is done under a system called guideline support. It's a computer program that the county uses. They basically plug the numbers in and they spit out how much you have to pay. What would you like to follow up with?
Okay, so let's say one spouse has a cash business and the other spouse wants to prove his or her income. How would that work?
Well, if there's a cash business involved, that means that person, or it's implied that that person isn't honestly reporting their income. So we have to call on a forensic accountant such as Vadim Levitman, and he would construct a model, a report to determine. And we're going to discuss in the program what does that report consist of. There are two basic reports that you need for support. The first one is cash available for support. The second one is marital standard of living. Now I'm going to explain those two. First of all, marital standard of living is the level of expenses that you were spending during the marriage, and you're entitled to be living in a divorce with support on the same level. So we would create what's called a marital standard living report. Cash available for support takes cash, takes income, takes business expenses, takes perks, takes all the places where an individual is using money to pay for personal family expenses. And that gets compiled into a report, and the total sum is the cash available for support and treated as income in the divorce case. So if you have a marital standard living report or a cash available for support report, and you present it with the required requirements, then the court will use those numbers instead of the numbers that the person is actually presenting to the court. So you can get a great advantage, because if the person is not disclosing their income and you come in with these reports, you get an honest support number for your client. And that's what we do for them.
Ah, that makes a lot of sense. Vadim, help me here. What information, more specifically, will you need in order to prepare a marital standard of living report?
A marital standard of living report, just like Barry described, is how much money was actually spent on a lifestyle. So what we need is financial records like bank statements, credit card receipts, so we can analyze where did they go shopping, how many times did they went to the restaurant, what restaurants they went to, where do they shop for clothes, how many times a year they go on a vacation, where do they go on a vacation. This way we can pretty much analyze how do they actually live.
Ah, that makes sense. Are there rules and regulations that accountants have to follow in order to prepare this for court?
Well, absolutely. In order to be a certified public accountant and a forensic accountant, there are vigorous tests that you have to pass. You need experience. And on top of everything, you have rules and regulations of certain organizations that you belong to, and you have to follow strict guidelines.
Got it, got it. And Barry, what happens when there are certified forensic accountants on both sides?
Well, that's a very interesting thing. You know, the whole divorce system is based on an adversarial system. That means each side puts on their case, and then they're opposite each other, and then the court will weigh and decide which witness is more credible, which witness's data is more accurate, and which method and analysis that the accountant used is more credible. And the court, because they see so many of these cases, they can tell. And also a lot of these accountants come into court on numerous cases, so they're before the court a lot. And when that familiarity starts to occur, they're trusted by the court when they give their opinions. And their opinions are contained in their reports.
That makes a lot of sense. So there's this term called tracing. Can you help me? Could you help me with that one?
Yes. Tracing is a very complicated accounting method. I'll tell you where it comes up. If you, before marriage, own a house or a business, and then you take money from that house and business and you put it into a new house when you're married, a community property house. You see, in family law, you have to identify which property is separate property of each spouse and which property is community. Community property is defined as all property received during the marriage from any source. Separate property is property received before the marriage or through inheritance or by gift. So we have to calculate that and figure out the characterization and then give it a value. So first we characterize it and then we give it a value. Now, if there's an investment from separate property into community property, the person that has the separate property investment has a right to reimbursement. That reimbursement has to be calculated. And the way it's calculated and presented is through a tracing.
Okay. Now, Vadim, tell me more. How do you construct a tracing?
Well, in order to do proper tracing, you need to you have to trace it to the source. Is it truly a separate asset or is it marital asset? Number one. So in order to obtain that information, you need to go back and get records, title reports from the different houses for properties. You need bank statements, and you trace the money or the flow of the money from one bank account to another bank account, because a lot of people throughout the years, they invest and reinvest and reinvest. So you need to trace this right into the joint account with a spouse.
Got it.
And something comes to mind that I could add to that. When you start out the tracing, you have to characterize what is the money in the first place. Now that's not a simple job, because if it's money from before marriage, you have to prove it. You have the burden of proof of proving it's separate property. So if you owned a house before, you have to get the title documents. If you had it in a bank account, you have to get the bank account documents. So the way a client can really help the attorney and the accountant is to collect all these documents and give them whatever they have.
That makes a lot of sense.
Very important.
Now, Vadim, what can you do to make the attorney's job, Barry's job, easier? What is that typical interface between accountant and attorney?
Oh, it's a very important interface. Normally what we do is we go through the financial records, we go through the bank statements again, tax returns, business records, and we compile what's called a kind of a shopping list. And we'll tell attorneys what documents we need to do a proper analysis. And when we get additional documents, we may even supplement that list with additional documents to obtain.
So when the accountant gives that list to me, the attorney, I send out what's called a request for production to the opposite party. But if there are third parties involved, like banks or other companies or businesses, we have to send out subpoenas. And we send them out, they take about 30 days, and then they come back. If they don't come back, we have to compel them and force them to be delivered. Now, once we get the documents, we turn them over to the accountant. And then the accountant looks at it and says, you know what? I noticed that when I looked through these documents, I found another business. Hey, you know, he had an account in Switzerland, and he had an account here, and the account that he had over here, he used that money and he bought a property for his girlfriend. So those things come up, and then there's a dialogue constantly going on between the accountant and the lawyer to follow up, to build the financial picture clearly.
Got it, got it. Now, Barry, once tracing is established, how does the court use that?
Well, the person claiming the separate property has the burden of proving to the court with substantial evidence that they have a right for reimbursement. So the tracing report is presented by the forensic accountant to the court. He's on the witness stand, he has his report, he submits it to the court, he validates it, he authenticates it, he says, I prepared the information, or my staff prepared the information, and everything in here is accurate and correct, and this is my opinion. And experts are allowed to express opinions in court. Then the court takes that opinion and says, okay, I accept it, I believe you, or I don't. Or I believe part of it. Or if there's a counter expert, maybe they'll take part of it. Maybe they'll take part from one expert and part from the other, and come up with what they think is the truth.
Got it. I've heard this term reimbursement. What does that mean?
Reimbursement, under the Family Code section, anybody that contributes separate property to a community property asset has a right to be reimbursed their separate property as long as there's enough equity in the property that there's enough funds to reimburse them at the time the property, at divorce or sale of the property.
Got it. Commingling? What is?
Okay, commingling, it's a technical term, but what it really is when you have separate property, you need to keep it separate. If you mix it into an account with community, it's called commingling. Now, once you do that, if you want to claim that separate property back, you have to do a tracing, and it's expensive. So if you want to keep your separate property, keep it separate, and we can teach you how to do that.
I understand. I understand. How do you protect and keep your separate property separate then during marriage?
The way you do it is you establish separate property accounts before marriage, and you maintain them throughout the whole marriage. If it's a business, you have a management company or someone doing the management on the business so that there could be no claim from the community. That's the simplest explanation. I could give more advice, but just call me for a free consultation and I'll help you.
And Vadim, when you meet with a couple and they talk to you about why should I have a forensic accountant in my life post-divorce, what do you say to them? Both parties have gone on, married again, and they're about to set their plan in motion. What would you suggest?
I would suggest keep the records very clear, to maintain proper characterization, so in the future there will be no issue as to who owns what.
Do you recommend separate accounts?
Absolutely.
Does that sometimes hurt feelings?
Yes, it does, but it's necessary.
And this whole issue of tracing, now that you look back and you see a couple, they've remarried, they've started their lives again, they've begun the process of keeping their separate properties separate. What other suggestions might you have for them?
Well, first, they should respect each other to begin with. But from the financial standpoint of view, whatever is separate, they must keep it separate. I cannot emphasize more and more. This is very, very important.
Understand. And Barry, you meet with a client and it's becoming clear that a forensic accountant must step into the picture. What do you talk about? What are the most important aspects of a forensic accountant as you're talking to your client?
Well, the first thing is that the forensic accountant has to be competent. There are many people that are accountants, but they don't have the special training. Forensic accounting is different. And you want to hire a forensic accountant that has the ability to not only do the financial analysis, but can take the stand in a trial and be cross-examined and answer the questions correctly. Some people freeze on the stand. Some people aren't good on the witness stand. So you should rely on your attorney to recommend a forensic accountant that he's worked with, that he's seen in action. Don't try to save money and go get your accountant to do the financial records when it's complicated, because you're going to need the forensic accountant with the special training.
What's the typical amount of money a couple may spend fighting one another in court and going that route?
Well, that has a lot to do with the length of the marriage, because if it's 20 years and you have multiple businesses and you have separate property businesses and community businesses, I mean, can you imagine the price tag on the Dodger forensic accounting divorce? It's got to be $5 to $10 million. I mean, it's got to be huge. But a run-of-the-mill divorce, you know, it could be as little as $5,000 and it could be as much as $100,000. And oftentimes, it's the parties that cause the additional expense. Because when you're fighting with your spouse, guess who's making the money? The lawyers, the accountants, and anyone else involved in your case. Don't fight with them. Sit down and work it out.
I may add that lack of documentation also add on to fees.
Give me an example of that.
If half a year worth of bank statements are missing, now we need to trace it. Now we need to recreate it. Now we need to use third party to estimate what happened to the money. How much is it in there?
How much time does that typically take? All of that document collection and all of that.
It varies. It varies a lot. It varies from client to client. It varies in different situations.
Wow. And I've heard this term hearsay, Barry. What does that mean?
Okay, well, hearsay is under the evidence code. In order to have evidence presented in court, it has to be competent evidence. Hearsay, the technical definition, an out-of-court statement that is offered to prove the truth of the matter asserted. So you're basically saying, this letter written by the policeman that observed something happening is being presented in court. That is a hearsay document. A statement by a third party is a hearsay. Those are not allowed into court. Now, for instance, bank records aren't allowed into court. How do you get around that exception? Well, there are some technical rules under the evidence code to get those business records in if they're properly subpoenaed. But there's a better way. If you use an expert and he's relied on those documents in his report, the court will not stop him from using those documents, and the hearsay that's normally not allowed can be admitted.
Wow. A lot of technical information. That's incredible. As a team, a forensic accountant and attorney, if the two of you enter into a case, at what stage does the forensic accountant step into the process?
Different stages. Sometimes day one. I sign up the client and I say, you need a forensic accountant for this case, and I call the forensic accountant and he retains the forensic accountant. He or she retains the forensic accountant. Sometimes it's in the middle of the case. When some issue comes up that you discover that you need the forensic accountant, you bring them in.
I see. I see. And is there sometimes some apprehension and fear on the part of maybe they'll find something that... I don't want them to find? Or
Well, not really. Usually the person I'm representing wants the information about the other person. So they're not worried about their exposure.
I see.
They're worried about how much it's going to cost and can you really do something. And one of the most interesting things in forensic accountants is when you have businesses that are not well documented, like cash businesses, there are ways to build a model, which I think Vadim is going to explain in a little while in the show, that how to do that so that you can prove the value of that asset, the characterization of that asset so you could bring it into the community and divide it, and for income purposes.
wow, that's really interesting. I want to hear more about that. Vadim, please.
When there is a cash business, there's a tendency to lower gross income. And naturally, net income is available to take home. So one of the ways that we do things is we rely on third parties, like vendors, suppliers. We look at the underlying business licenses and tax returns to determine what is the actual true gross income. So what we do is we obtain this information, we analyze it, we come up with a gross profit margin analysis, and from there we can recreate the gross amount or the net income that the business actually earns.
So it's a snapshot, basically, yeah?
It's more than a snapshot, but that's the best information that we have available.
Right.
Let me give you an example. For instance, let's say you had a clothing business. It's a good one to take as an example. And the person was dealing in cash. Well, that person buys buttons, zippers, fabric, packaging, boxes to ship, all kinds of supplies. Now, the amount of supplies they buy is based on the amount of production. So someone that's experienced in forensic accounting goes to a clothing manufacturer expert and says, okay, how much cloth do you use to make a blouse?
Ah, I see.
And they purchased 1 million yards of fabric, and I don't know how much it takes, but let's assume it's 1 yard. So that means they made 1 million blouses.
Right, and those vendors had to be paid, so that had to be paid out of...
Well, we don't care how they were paid. We're only interested to construct a model. So if you have 1 million blouses, how much were they selling one blouse for?
Wow,
Now you got the gross, because you know how much they sold the gross for. It's their burden to come back and prove the business expenditures. We have the burden of showing, hey, look, he made $40 million on blouses. He's only shown $1 million. He has to come back with records and show that we're wrong.
I see.
So it's kind of like it's called like a reconstruction, where you reconstruct the business.
And once you have that anatomy, you can be quite credible in court at that point for your
Quite
client,
credible.
I imagine.
It takes a lot of discovery because you have to go to all these third-party vendors. You have to find out who the vendors are, who the suppliers are. You have to get that from the opposing side and then branch out.
I see.
So it's a long process.
What if it's on a computer?
It usually is on a computer. And in discovery, you're allowed to get their computer.
Ah, I see.
You're allowed to get the computer records.
I see.
And when I say discovery, you may not know what that is. We are allowed to request documents from the other side. That's called discovery. So we can request the hard drive, a copy of the computer, access to the computer, inspection of the computer.
I see. Now, Vadim, you have this computer. What happens then?
I go in there and I go through the list. I'll discover who are the vendors, what their names are, what is the activity with that vendor, and then I will do a follow-up with the vendor, or rather I will request an attorney to contact the vendor and obtain documents from the vendor so I can do proper analysis as to how many supplies were used or ordered.
I see. Is each case unique?
Each case is unique.
Each business is unique.
Each
Takes
client
a lot
is
of
unique.
expertise, I
Well,
imagine.
there's also another phenomena that happens in all divorces. Whenever people go through a divorce, their income drops because they don't want to give it to the other spouse. Their businesses start failing. There's all
Right.
kinds of shenanigans that go on, and you need a good lawyer and a good accountant to make sure that that doesn't happen to you. But we can save you a lot of money because of our experience. We can do it in an economical way.
So that relationship between the attorney and the accountant is critical.
Very critical.
And what is that time frame for discovery typically?
From the 30 days after the case begins till 30 days before trial.
I see. So that document collection, what still is needed, conversation with client, the two of you really have to have your heads together pretty closely then,
Absolutely.
I imagine. What happens if you, Vadim, have a relationship with the accountant on the other side? Sometimes is there some ability to come to terms?
Absolutely. There's always, we could be friends, but we also could be an adversary in court, and we respect each other in that regard.
The real experienced forensic accountants, they know each other. They've been up against each other in multiple cases, just like experienced lawyers. So when they get into complicated cases, they usually exchange their reports. They usually share their data. And then they try to come to a consensus, because the forensic accountant is not supposed to be an advocate. He or she is supposed to be an objective expert. So it's not like Vadim is going to take my side or my client's side in the case. He's going to say, these are the records, these are the data, and he's going to be as objective as he can to come to a conclusion. So the forensics sometimes meet, confer. Sometimes they settle cases that way.
And is the judge able to follow all of these facts and figures?
Absolutely. The judges, the family law court in Los Angeles and the state of California is very sophisticated. And most of the family law judges have been doing it for a while. They know what's going on. And the forensic accountants point out what they need to know. Because if they go into an area that they never heard of before, the forensic accountant will be asked questions by the opposing lawyer, by the lawyer on the same side, and by the judge, so it makes sense.
I understand. Sometimes can both sides come to agreement so they don't have to fight it out in court?
Well, that's
Does that
the
ever
best
happen?
solution in a divorce, if they come to an agreement. That's the greatest, most economical, most efficient thing you can do, is sit down and come to an agreement. But if you can't, you come get an attorney and we'll help you. You know, we're near the end of our show, and I want to take a moment to thank Jody Isaac for being our moderator and Vadim Levittman for being here.
Thanks for being here.
I really appreciate it. And I also want to thank the staff at KBEV and the students, because they do a remarkable job of producing our show. They do everything on the show. Everything you see on camera, everything you see on the TV set has been done from students, high school students. They have quite a future in front of them because they have amazing opportunity by helping us and working on this show, and we thank them. And we hope you tune in to our next show. We're going to have a weekly show, so every week we're going to try to do a subject that helps you, and thank you for being with us today. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.
We thank you for tuning in and invite you, our viewing audience, to participate in the next week's conversation. Our goal on the Divorce Project is to help bring you the healthy outcome that your family deserves. Please email your questions to team@thedivorceproject.com or call us directly at the number on your screen.